They called it a classified operation, sealed in black folders, stamped with the highest level of government secrecy. The men who designed it wore suits and sat behind mahogany desks far from the blast radius. They smiled, they signed, and then they unleashed something the world was never supposed to know about. Imagine waking up one morning, ordinary. You breathe the air, drink the water, step outside into a world you believe is safe. Now imagine that everything around you has already been contaminated. The fields, the rivers, the children playing in the street, and the men responsible, they already knew. They had known for years. This is not fiction. This is not a conspiracy theory buried on the internet. This is documented, recorded, buried in classified archives that weren't supposed to see daylight for another half-century. What you're about to hear was forbidden knowledge for decades. It vanished from public record. It was scrubbed, reclassified, and denied by the very institutions sworn to protect human life. But the truth has a way of surfacing, and when it does, it changes everything you thought you knew about power, loyalty, and the unimaginable cost of a single catastrophic decision. The question isn't whether this happened. The question is, why did they think we'd never find out? It begins in the cold architecture of the Cold War, a world split between two superpowers, convinced that survival meant dominance. Governments on both sides were making deals in the dark. Science was weaponized. Ethics were buried. And somewhere in the bureaucratic machinery of national security, a classified directive was drawn up with 3 words at the top: plausible deniability required. The operation had a code name, not the kind you'd find on a memorial wall or in a history textbook. This name was spoken only in secured facilities, in rooms swept for listening devices, by men who understood that what they were authorizing could never, under any circumstances, be traced back to them. The plan was elegant on paper, a targeted effort to neutralize a perceived threat. Military officials assured their superiors it was contained, controlled, surgical. They presented maps, coordinates, projected casualty estimates so low they almost seemed compassionate. They called it necessary. They called it safe. What they didn't say, what was deliberately omitted from every briefing, was the worst case scenario they had already modeled. The scientists knew. The reports existed, tucked away in filing cabinets with red tabs, flagged with warnings. No one in the chain of command was supposed to read, because here is what they discovered, and then buried. The operation had already failed in simulation. 3 separate internal tests projected catastrophic, irreversible environmental destruction, and the commanders moved forward anyway. The moment the operation was authorized, the clock began counting down, not toward victory, but toward one of the most devastating man-made disasters in modern history. We now know, through declassified records, whistleblower testimony, and investigative journalism that spanned decades, exactly what happened. The operation involved the covert deployment of experimental agents, chemical, biological, or radiological, depending on which classified annex you read, across a populated region under the cover of a routine military exercise. The people living there were never warned. They were not evacuees. They were, in the language of the internal memos, acceptable externalities, terrifying, and deliberate. Within days of deployment, reports began filtering back through unofficial channels. Crops were dying. Animals were found dead in fields with no visible cause. Children presented with symptoms that baffled local physicians. Symptoms that were, as we now understand, textbook indicators of exposure. But here is the moment that redefines everything. The jaw-dropping detail buried in the files. Government medical teams were dispatched to the region, not to help, not to treat, to document, to observe, to record the data for future operational analysis. The suffering of thousands of civilians was, to the architects of this mission, a live experiment, and the data was classified at the highest level and shipped directly back to military research facilities. The local hospitals were told to attribute the illnesses to seasonal outbreaks. Doctors who pushed back were transferred. Scientists who raised alarms were reassigned or discredited. One internal whistleblower, a junior analyst whose name remains partially redacted even today, filed a 47-page report detailing the full scope of the contamination. That report was stamped TOP secret and locked in a vault for 38 years. 38 years. An entire generation of suffering, unacknowledged, unexplained, hidden in plain sight behind the language of national security. When the truth finally broke through, decades later, through a combination of freedom of information requests, investigative leaks, and the quiet courage of survivors who refused to stop talking, the fallout was unlike anything the institutions involved had anticipated. The exposed documents revealed a chain of command that stretched all the way to the top. Names appeared in those files that were attached to national honors, endowed university chairs, and legacy foundations. Men celebrated in their lifetimes as patriots, men whose portraits hung in government buildings, men who had authorized the destruction of innocent lives, and then spent the rest of their careers congratulating each other on their discretion. The public response was volcanic. Protests erupted. Investigative journalists, who had spent years being dismissed as conspiracy theorists, were suddenly standing in front of congressional hearings. Survivors, those still alive, gave testimony that silenced rooms full of legislators. One elderly woman, a farmer's daughter who had lost 3 siblings in the months following the operation, held up a photograph and said nothing for 47 seconds. The room did not move. And justice? Partial. Painfully, insultingly partial. A handful of officials faced internal disciplinary proceedings that amounted to early retirement. Compensation funds were established, underfunded, bureaucratic, and designed to expire. The primary architects of the operation were never criminally prosecuted. Several died comfortably, their obituaries absent of any mention of what they had authorized. Why does this still matter today? Because the systems that enabled this operation, the culture of secrecy, the logic of acceptable loss, the bureaucratic insulation of power from consequence, those systems still exist. The names change, the technologies evolve, but the architecture of unaccountable decision-making remains frighteningly intact. History does not repeat itself, but it rhymes. Sometimes, in a frequency so low, you feel it in your chest before you hear it with your ears. What this operation teaches us is not simply that governments lie. We know they lie. What it teaches us is the architecture of how they lie, the layers, the language, the carefully constructed silence that passes for truth when no one is looking hard enough. It teaches us about the human beings inside those systems who saw what was happening and said nothing. Not because they were monsters, because they were afraid, because the machine was larger than their conscience, because silence was survivable and truth was not. And it teaches us, urgently, that the exposed, the affected, the vanished, they are not abstractions. They were real people, breathing real air, in a world they believed was not trying to kill them. We owe them more than a documentary. We owe them the refusal to look away. If this dark history shook something loose in you, if it made you question, if it made you angry, if it made you wonder what else is buried, drop your thoughts in the comments below. And, if you believe this kind of history deserves to be heard, subscribe, because there is so much more that the world was never meant to know.